So, you look at Singapore on a map, this tiny island, the famous red dot, and it's easy to just see the gleaming skyscrapers and think, modern miracle, right? Popped up overnight.
Right, that's the common image.
But the truth, as we're about to discover, is that Singapore's story is centuries in the making. It's full of twists, turns, power shifts, things you wouldn't necessarily guess just looking at it now.
Absolutely.
You've shared some fantastic material with us, really great sources. And our mission today, really, is to unpack those pivotal moments, that hidden history that actually forged this powerhouse we see today.
Exactly. We're going far beyond, the economic miracle of the last few decades. Your sources let us trace this really fascinating lineage, revealing how a seemingly insignificant island kind of repeatedly caught in the cross-currents of regional powers ultimately carved out its own unique destiny. It's a story with mythical beginnings and a series of incredibly strategic decisions.
Okay, so let's dive right into that beginning then, the name itself. Singapore, the Lion City. That's a pretty iconic image. Where does that actually come from?
Right. The popular legend, it dates back to the late 13th century. It tells the tale of Prince Sang Nila Utama from Palembang.
Okay.
And the story goes that he saw a creature, he believed it was a lion, and subsequently named the settlement Singapura. It's derived from the Sanskrit words Singha for lion and Pura for city.
The Lion City.
Exactly. This Lion City myth has certainly captured the popular imagination. It's become a key part of Singapore's origin story.
But I understand that even fairly early on, people weren't necessarily taking that lion story literally. Was that the case?
Well, what's intriguing is that by the 15th century, you find historical accounts from Chinese travelers like Ma Huan.
Right.
They actually refer to the Lion City as more of a mythical name than, a description of the actual wildlife.
Oh.
So this early questioning of the foundational myth, it really highlights the complex interplay between legend and historical record right from the start. And, beyond the name, this little island was constantly being influenced by much larger empires around it.
Like the Majapahit Empire, for example, you mentioned that.
Precisely. The Majapahit Empire, based in Java, held sway over Singapore until the late 14th or maybe early 15th century.
Right.
Following its decline, the Sultanate of Johor rose to prominence, becoming the dominant regional power.
Right.
And Singapore, strategically located, it became part of this Johor system, basically a network of territories that paid tribute to the Sultan. Control over the Temasek system, which included not just Singapore, but also nearby settlements. That was a significant point of contention for Johor. It represented control over vital trade routes in the area, you see.
So given this prime location, why didn't Singapore become a major trading power way back then? It seems like a bit of a no-brainer on the map.
That's a great question, and it points to a key insight. For centuries, the main east-west trade routes were largely dominated by the vast and relatively self-sufficient economies of the Chinese dynastic empires.
Ah, okay. Internal trade was bigger.
Yeah, their internal trade networks were so well established that they didn't have a huge need for a major external trading hub in Southeast Asia. It was just a different world of trade compared to what would emerge later.
Right.
Meanwhile, you had the European powers with their growing demand for spices, resources. They were only just beginning their significant forays into the East.
Right. So different needs driving different patterns of trade. But Singapore, under the name Temasek, it existed long before Raffles showed up.
Oh, absolutely. We have archaeological evidence, historical accounts.
Yeah.
They show that as early as the 14th century and likely even earlier Malay traders from the Srivijaya kingdom.
Right. Srivijaya controlled the Strait of Malacca.
Exactly. They'd already established trading posts there. Its strategic position, right at the nexus of these vital sea lanes, made it a natural draw for merchants from various kingdoms across the region, the Mataram Kingdom of Java, Ace, even traders from the distant Ming Dynasty in China.
Were there attempts to build something more substantial there before the 19th century, like forts or bigger settlements?
Yes, actually. In the early 1500s, after Malacca fell to the Portuguese.
Right, 1511.
The Malay rulers of the time, they were seeking to maintain their influence in the region, and they actually built a fort on Singapore.
Okay.
However, control of the island then became a point of contention between the Sultanate of Johor and the increasingly powerful Dutch East India Company.
Ah, the Dutch.
Yeah. And in a move to cripple their Johor rivals, the Dutch forces actually attacked and burned down the settlement in Singapore in 1613.
Burned it down. Wow.
Yeah, it was a devastating act. It left the island largely uninhabited for almost 2 centuries.
2 centuries. It's almost impossible to picture that bustling metropolis just lying deserted.
It really is.
But even before that destruction, you mentioned Temasek as a significant port much earlier, maybe even in the 2nd century.
Well, what's truly fascinating, some historical records indicate that as early as the 2nd century AD, a port called Temasek was indeed thriving. It had trade links stretching far and wide: India, China, Arabia.
Really? That early?
It seems so. It even held a degree of importance within the Siamese Empire at one point. However, the rise of Malacca in the 15th century with its more centralized control of trade led to Temasek's gradual decline.
Okay, so Malacca overshadowed it.
Pretty much. Then, after Malacca fell to the Portuguese in 1511, the whole region was plunged into decades of conflict. You had Johor, Pahang, the seafaring Bugis people. It was constant fighting.
Chaos.
Exactly. Further disrupting any potential for Singapore to reemerge as a major center back then.
So it was this constant back and forth of power and conflict. And just before Raffles arrived, I understand the area was reorganized somewhat. What was it called?
That's right. In the years leading up to 1819, the area that would become modern Singapore was apparently known as Dihimi.
Yeah, it's a bit obscure, but the name essentially reflected its geographical layout, situated near Kampong Glam and the split of the Singapore River.
Huh. Okay.
So when Sir Stamford Raffles arrived, it wasn't a completely blank slate, but it was certainly a far cry from the thriving port it had once been centuries before, and equally far from the global hub it was about to become.
And that brings us to that pivotal moment. Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles landing in 1819. What exactly was his mission? I mean, what brought him to this relatively quiet island?
Well, Raffles was a highly ambitious, very influential figure within the British East India Company.
Right.
He had previously served, quite notably, as the Lieutenant Governor of Java. When the British decided to return Java to the Dutch in 1816, Raffles recognized this urgent need for a new strategic foothold in the region for the company.
Okay, so losing Java was the trigger.
It was a major factor, and he had heard reports, apparently from Malay fishermen, about a promising port called Singapura. They also referred to it as Yasan, a term suggesting, a place of wealth or resources. So this was purely a strategic move for the British East India Company then, geopolitics and trade.
Absolutely. The Straits of Malacca were, and still are, one of the most critical arteries for global trade. The decline of established regional powers like Johor created this kind of power vacuum, and the British were determined to expand their sphere of influence. They desperately needed a well-positioned base to protect their increasingly vital merchant shipping, to serve as a key point in their naval strategy, and, crucially, to compete economically with other European powers.
Especially the French and the Dutch.
Particularly the French and the Dutch, yes, they were all vying for control in Southeast Asia.
But it wasn't just the British seeing an opportunity, was it? I remember reading in the sources that some local leaders also viewed the British arrival, well, perhaps favorably.
That's a crucial insight, yeah. Many local leaders, particularly those facing internal conflicts or threats from piracy, which was rampant in the region.
Big problem back then.
Huge problem. They saw the British presence as a potential source of stability and protection. So it wasn't simply a case of the British imposing their will. There was a degree of local acceptance, maybe even expectation, of the benefits that could come with a British presence.
And the economic potential of controlling trade through the Straits, I mean, that has been a massive factor.
Immense. The east-west trade flowing through the Straits was incredibly lucrative. Spices, textiles, other valuable commodities moving in vast quantities.
Right.
However, as we touched on, piracy and political instability posed significant threats to this trade. The emergence of new Malay states in the peninsula further complicated the existing power dynamics and trade routes.
Okay.
And the weakening of the Johor Sultanate, coupled with the ongoing Dutch-Javanese War, created the significant power vacuum right in this crucial maritime choke point. The British were very eager to exploit that.
They already had footholds in Penang and Bencoolen, didn't they?
Yeah.
Why was Singapore so much more attractive? What was different?
Precisely. While Penang and Bencoolen were British possessions, they weren't as strategically positioned to control the vital straits of Malacca. Not really.
Location.
Exactly. The British were particularly concerned about the growing Dutch influence and their potential control over key areas like bunker, which could severely disrupt British shipping lanes.
Right.
Singapore's close proximity to Rio, where a local leader, a Mushi, and a Temenggung held sway after the Dutch takeover of Rio, offered the British a much more advantageous location to establish a trading post and exert control over the straits.
Now, when Raffles and his team arrived, who was actually living on Singapore at that specific time, what kind of community did they find there?
Well, interestingly, the initial population was relatively small, and it was primarily composed of non-Malay-speaking immigrants, people who had come from various parts of the southern Malay Peninsula, even as far as Thailand.
Okay, so quite diverse already.
Yes, and Tamil and Muslim migrants from India also formed a notable segment of the early labor force. They contributed significantly to building the initial infrastructure and cultivating cash crops that helped the new settlement grow.
It sounds like a bit of a rough and ready frontier town in those early years. Is that fair?
Oh, it certainly was. With a limited established local authority right after Raffles' arrival, the environment was quite fluid and, yeah, at times pretty lawless.
Like the Wild West, but in Southeast Asia.
Sort of. Opium dens, gambling houses, brothels, they quickly sprang up. Different groups of immigrants, often aligned with their own community leaders, they vied for influence over local trade. They even laid claim to territories along the coast. It was a far cry from the highly regulated, orderly Singapore we know today.
Definitely.
But it's important to remember, even then, there were existing economic activities, like the long-standing trade connections with places like Kelantan and a well-established local fishing industry. It wasn't entirely from scratch.
So Raffles, recognizing the deep waters there, he initially envisioned Singapore as a key port for the opium trade. Was that a main driver?
That was certainly a significant aspect of the early economic considerations, yes. The licensing of opium and gambling dens became a major source of revenue for the nascent administration in those early days.
Right. Got to fund the new venture somehow.
Exactly. And this period also saw the informal emergence of a kind of one country, three systems approach, you could say, where different ethnic communities were often subject to their own customs and leadership in certain aspects of life.
It's quite a contrast to the later image of Singapore as this tightly controlled, almost meticulously planned state. I recall reading that it eventually became quite a police state under British rule, with its own issues regarding the justice system.
Well, over time, as the British consolidated their control, they did establish a strong administrative and police presence, yeah. And yes, historical accounts like the ones you provided do point to concerns regarding the justice system and limitations on personal liberties during the colonial era. However, by the 1920s and 30s, Singapore had evolved into a significant and relatively prosperous colonial city. There were growing efforts towards municipal reform, urban planning, culminating in the development of a comprehensive master plan to guide its future growth.
Let's rewind just a bit to those pre-Raffles days again. You mentioned the Orang Laut and the Sino-Javanese Empire earlier. How did they factor into the history of Singapore before 1819?
Right. The Orang Laut, the Sea People, they were among the earliest inhabitants of the islands and coastal regions. Their lives were intimately connected to fishing, maritime activities.
Okay.
The influence of the Sino-Javanese Empire, particularly during the 13th and 14th centuries, brought an increase in foreign trade to the broader Malay Peninsula region, and undoubtedly Singapore benefited from this increased activity.
So trade was already happening, just maybe not on a massive scale.
Exactly. As we discussed, valuable goods like areca nuts, pepper, gold, ivory, even exotic items like swiftletness were important commodities traded through these networks.
No.
Johor's rise as a key trading center after the fall of Malacca in 1511 was significant, but its subsequent destabilization due to intense piracy in the region. Ironically, that made a relatively quiet spot like Singapore potentially more attractive for establishing a secure trading post.
So instability elsewhere made Singapore look better.
Potentially, yes.
And Temenggung Abdul Rahman, he was a local leader in Singapore just before the British arrived. You mentioned him.
Yes, Temenggung Abdul Rahman. He had familial ties to the Sultanate of Johor, and he was indeed residing in Singapore when Raffles arrived.
Okay.
While Singapore wasn't a major economic hub at that precise moment, his presence was a crucial factor in Raffles' calculations. He needed to secure an agreement with a local authority to establish a British settlement.
Makes sense. Couldn't just walk in.
Not formally, no. And even before Raffles' arrival, the British East India Company had shown interest in acquiring a naval base in the vicinity of Temasek to protect their growing maritime trade routes after they had established themselves in Penang and Bencoolen.
So the idea wasn't totally new for them.
No, Raffles's decision to formally establish a British settlement wasn't a completely spontaneous act. It built upon existing strategic considerations and, of course, the inherent geographical advantages of Singapore as a potential free port and trading post.
Okay, let's fast forward then through the established colonial era to the immense disruption of World War II and the brutal Japanese occupation. This must have been a truly transformative and terrible period for Singapore.
Oh, this period is absolutely critical to understanding Singapore's trajectory towards independence and its subsequent development. Japan's involvement in Southeast Asia escalated significantly after World War I. By 1940, their occupation of French Indochina prompted Britain to dispatch warships to Singapore.
Right, the famous Force Z.
Yes, hoping to deter further Japanese aggression. However, a series of significant strategic miscalculations by the British,
Oh,
including a profound underestimation of Japanese military capabilities and a flawed deployment of their naval forces in the region, ultimately proved disastrous.
the decision to dismantle parts of the Singapore fortress. That seems like a particularly critical error in hindsight, reading through the material.
It was a major contributing factor, yes. Along with other strategic missteps, it likely emboldened the Japanese. In December 1941, Japanese aircraft launched devastating bombing raids on Singapore, severely crippling its air defenses.
And then the ground invasion.
Followed by a swift and effective ground invasion in early 1942. The British, in a desperate attempt to deny resources to the advancing Japanese, implemented a scorched earth policy.
Which must have hurt the locals, too.
It certainly had significant consequences for the local infrastructure and population, yes. The eventual fall of Singapore in February 1942 was a deeply humiliating blow to the British Empire and a profound shock to the local population.
And the occupation itself, by all accounts, sounds like a period of immense hardship and brutality.
The initial phase of Japanese rule saw some attempts, to cultivate goodwill among the local population, propaganda, promises of a new order.
The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere.
Exactly. However, this veneer quickly crumbled, giving way to a brutal reign of terror. Illegal imprisonment became commonplace. Massacres, particularly targeting Chinese residents due to perceived anti-Japanese sentiments and communist sympathies, were carried out.
The Suk-Ching Massacre.
Yes. And horrific acts of torture were inflicted. The Japanese also actively sought to exacerbate existing racial tensions between the Chinese and Malay communities.
So it sounds like it fundamentally fractured the existing social order, just ripped it apart.
It did. The Japanese authorities dissolved existing social clubs, political organizations, labor unions. They attempted to impose their own ideology and values through the education system, a process they termed thought purification.
Chilling term.
Isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
The established systems of law, finance, markets were thrown into chaos. It led to widespread instability and a breakdown of law and order. Singapore was effectively cut off from the outside world, and severe punishments were imposed for even minor offenses, like possessing foreign currency or hoarding food.
The impact on everyday life must have been utterly devastating. Just survival must have been hard.
Absolutely. Famine became widespread. Diseases like cholera and dysentery ravaged the weakened population, leading to countless deaths from malnutrition and illness.
Terrible.
Agricultural production plummeted due to non-cooperation and forced labor, further exacerbating the severe food shortages and fueling a dangerous black market. This entire period, it just profoundly shattered people's trust in the stability of modernity, the supposed safeguards of civilization. The occupation was a deeply traumatic experience that left an indelible mark on the collective memory of Singaporeans.
So after the war, the British returned, but the landscape had irrevocably shifted. The genie was out of the bottle, so to speak. The push for independence was gaining serious momentum.
That's right. While Singapore's historical role as a vital entrepot, with its crucial deepwater harbor, remained fundamental, and industries like shipbuilding, tin smelting, rubber processing began to recover. The post-war era was characterized by significant social and economic challenges.
Like what specifically?
Well, there was widespread labor unrest, fueled by poor working conditions, low wages. Infrastructure was in disrepair, housing was grossly inadequate, economic growth was sluggish, and unemployment soared. And this was exacerbated by a rapidly expanding labor force, the post-war baby boom.
And this unrest and these challenges, they directly fueled the growing calls for independence. eventually leading to the merger with Malaya.
Yes, exactly. The increasing political pressure for self-determination or independence, coupled with the desire for greater economic stability and security, led to the formation of the Federation of Malaysia in 1963.
Okay.
This new nation included the Federation of Malaya, Singapore, and the British territories in Borneo. However, this merger was ultimately short-lived.
Only 2 years.
Just 2 years. Due to deep-seated political and ideological differences, as well as ethnic tensions between the leadership in Singapore and the central government in Kuala Lumpur.
And then, just like that, the unexpected separation and Singapore's emergence as a fully independent nation in 1965.
Quite sudden. It really was. In 1965, Singapore was unexpectedly separated, some might say expelled, from the Federation and became a sovereign, independent nation. Initially, there were widespread fears, anxieties about its economic viability. A small, resource-poor island state standing alone.
Yeah, it must have seemed daunting.
Extremely. However, under strong and determined leadership, Singapore embarked on this remarkable journey, successfully tackling unemployment, rapidly raising living standards, and implementing large-scale public housing programs for its population.
Lee Kuan Yew, as the first prime minister, was obviously a central figure during this tumultuous period. He looms large in the history.
Absolutely. Even before Singapore's full independence, the British had gradually granted increasing levels of self-government. In 1955, limited self-government was introduced.
The Rendell Constitution.
Exactly. And the People's Action Party, PAP, under the leadership of Lee Kuan Yew, achieved a landslide victory in the 1959 general elections. This marked a crucial turning point, with Lee Kuan Yew becoming the first prime minister of the now self-governing state of Singapore. The subsequent decision to merge with Malaysia in 1963 was a key policy of the PAP, although it faced significant opposition from the left-wing Barisan Socialist Party.
Right, the split within the PAP.
Yes. The PAP government also took decisive action to crack down on what it perceived as pro-communist elements within its own ranks and in the broader political landscape. The increasing political and economic tensions with the central government in Kuala Lumpur ultimately proved irreconcilable.
Leading to the expulsion.
Leading to Singapore's expulsion from Malaysia on August 9th, 1965. A deeply emotional moment, as you probably know from the famous footage of Lee Kuan Yew.
Yes, absolutely. It must have been an incredibly uncertain and volatile time for everyone in Singapore, just thrown out on their own.
It was. The immediate aftermath of the separation saw a period of tense rhetoric between Singapore and Malaysia, understandably.
Yeah.
However, within a relatively short time, Singapore's financial market stabilized. And the then Prime Minister of Malaysia, Tun Abdul Razak, signaled a shift towards a more cooperative relationship.
That seems quick, considering the circumstances.
Well, the historical, economic, and social ties between the two nations were simply too strong, too intertwined to ignore in the long run.
It's remarkable how quickly the relationship began to normalize, relatively speaking. You mentioned the Rendell Constitution earlier and the gradual path to self-governance. Can you maybe elaborate a bit more on those steps?
Yes, the Rendell Constitution, introduced by the British in 1955, was a significant step towards self-governance. It established a limited form of internal autonomy with a chief minister as the head of government.
And that was David Marshall first.
David Marshall of the Labour Front, yes, became the first chief minister under this new constitution. However, his efforts to negotiate full internal self-government with the British were initially unsuccessful, leading to his resignation. Lim Yu Hook succeeded him and ultimately achieved full internal self-government for Singapore in 1959. Under this new arrangement, Singapore had control over all domestic matters, while Britain retained responsibility for defense and foreign policy.
So still some strings attached.
Still some strings. And this period was also marked by considerable political ferment within Singapore itself. Significant ideological differences between the left and right wings of the political spectrum, even within the ruling PAP.
Factionalism.
Exactly. Labor strikes and social unrest were common, leading to the Merdeka talks in London and the controversial arrests of some PAP leaders. Ultimately, the PAP found itself increasingly at odds with the central government in the Malaysian Federation, culminating in the dissolution of the federal cabinet and Singapore's unexpected expulsion.
So looking back at this long arc of history, that crucial strategic location, it's just been a constant thread, hasn't it? It's
Yes.
what initially drew the British, and it ultimately fueled Singapore's growth as this major entrepot.
Absolutely. The strategic geographical location was the enduring factor. The establishment of a free trade port by Raffles in 1819 acted as the primary catalyst for Singapore's rapid transformation from a relatively obscure island into a major global trading hub. Even the devastating impact of World War II couldn't erase this fundamental advantage. And remarkably, Singapore achieved its independence in 1965 not through armed conflict, but through a complex process of political negotiation and ultimately separation.
No bloodshed, which is quite something.
Quite something. The attainment of self-governance in 1959 was a critical stepping stone, even with continued British oversight in certain areas. While the merger with Malaya was driven by a desire for greater security and economic integration, the deep political and racial tensions ultimately led to the irreconcilable differences and Singapore's unilateral declaration of independence.
It's interesting to consider the initial economic focus of the Malay states on forest products and the British interest in Borneo primarily to curb the smuggling of Chinese tributes, as mentioned in the sources. It paints a picture of a very different regional economic landscape back then.
It does indeed. Singapore's rapid emergence as the dominant entrepot in the region after the 1819 treaty was also linked to environmental changes in the surrounding areas and a shift in economic priorities, including, interestingly, a decline in the once lucrative opium trade revenues.
Okay.
This confluence of factors allowed Singapore to quickly surpass its regional rivals, places like Malacca and Banjarmasin, in terms of international trade and standing.
So, after this really dramatic journey to full independence in '65, how did Singapore then forge its path in terms of economic, social, and political development, building this modern nation?
Well, the entrepot economy remained the bedrock initially. A continued strong focus on processing and transshipping goods from the region. Industries like shipbuilding and repair, tin smelting, the processing of rubber and copra from the Malay Peninsula, they continued to be important.
Go.
Singapore solidified its role as a key regional distribution center for European manufactured goods, and it also held strategic military significance for the British Commonwealth in the post-war era. However, as we discussed, the immediate post-WWII economic problems were severe, and the separation from Malaysia created a whole new set of economic challenges. The decisive leadership of Lee Kuan Yew was absolutely instrumental in tackling the urgent issues of unemployment, raising living standards for the population, and providing widespread access to public housing.
The HDB flats.
The HDB flats, exactly, a cornerstone of social policy.
The push for industrialization in the late 1950s, even before full independence, that was a really significant shift in economic strategy, wasn't it? Moving beyond just trade.
Absolutely. Recognizing the long-term limitations of relying solely on the entrepot trade and anticipating a potential decline in the agricultural sector, the government made a strategic decision to aggressively promote industrialization.
Proactive.
Very. The establishment of the Jurong Industrial Estate in the early 1960s was a landmark initiative in this effort. Recognizing the lack of significant domestic capital and industrial expertise, the government actively sought foreign investment and played a crucial role in guiding economic development through institutions like the Singapore Industrial Development Corporation, or SIDC, established in 1961.
Oh.
Despite lacking significant natural resources, Singapore astutely leveraged its strategic location, its growing reputation for stability, efficiency, rule of law, to position itself as a major global financial and international business hub.
And it's grown into such a sophisticated and influential financial center on the world stage today. It's incredible.
Indeed. The strategic development of the Singapore Exchange, SGX, as a unified platform for securities and derivatives trading, that was critical, including establishing the Securities Clearing Corporation, SCC, and the Singapore Exchange Derivatives Trading Ltd, SGXDT. Furthermore, the consolidation of financial regulatory functions under the Monetary Authority of Singapore, MAS, which was formed by renaming and expanding the role of the Securities and Futures Commission, SFC, further solidified its position as a leading, well-regulated financial center.
Technology and connectivity have also played a massive role in Singapore's rapid development, haven't they? Infrastructure seems key.
Undeniably. Advancements in communication infrastructure began relatively early in Singapore's modern history. A formal postal service in 1843.
Wow, that early.
Followed by telegraph services in 1881, the first telephone exchange in 1884. The laying of the first undersea telegraph cable in 1885 was a significant step in connecting Singapore to the wider world.
Laying the groundwork.
Exactly. The government recognized the crucial role of telecommunications in economic development. This led to the separation of the Postal and Telecommunication Department in 1966 and a sustained effort to modernize the industry, introducing direct exchange connections, eventually adopting computer technologies.
And mobile phones.
By 1990, Singapore had achieved the distinction of being the first country in the world to have a completely privatized mobile telephone service, highlighting its commitment to technological advancement, staying ahead of the curve.
Socially and culturally, how did this incredibly diverse population, with its different languages, customs, religions, how did it coalesce into a unified national identity? That seems like a huge challenge.
Nation building in Singapore was and remains a complex, multifaceted undertaking. Given its historical patchwork of diverse nationalities and cultures,
Right.
the approach adopted involved actively constructing a shared national identity, built upon the foundation of English as a common language for administration and education.
A pragmatic choice.
A pragmatic choice, yes. Coupled with a strong emphasis on achieving economic success within a framework of market capitalism. The spectacular economic growth that Singapore experienced in the decades following independence, driven by significant multinational investment and initially policies aimed at addressing ethnic imbalances. That played a crucial role in fostering a sense of shared destiny, shared success.
You mentioned the complexities of Singapore's multicultural society in the notes. It's more nuanced than just acknowledging the presence of different ethnic groups, isn't it? There's a specific model.
Precisely. The development of multiculturalism in Singapore has its roots, perhaps ironically, in the relatively hands-off approach of the British colonial administration towards its diverse subjects, which inadvertently created the conditions for a unique form of social coexistence.
Okay.
Over time, this has evolved into what some scholars have termed plural monoculture, where distinct ethnic and cultural identities are maintained and respected, but within a unified civil framework defined by legal citizenship and shared national institutions and values. CMIO, Chinese, Malay, Indian, others.
Right, that framework. And the education system has been absolutely central to this project of forging a national identity, hasn't it?
Absolutely central. The formal education system in Singapore is mandatory and largely free for citizens and permanent residents. Structured under the guiding principles of national education, it encompasses all levels from preschool to university. There's a strong foundational emphasis on primary school education's standardized subject sets. While there is a diverse landscape of preschool options private, government-run the curriculum consistently emphasizes bilingualism. English as the primary language of instruction and a designated national language, or mother tongue Malay, Mandarin, or Tamil also taught.
And the nationalist agenda.
Well, the nationalist agenda is quite evident in the way Singapore's history and national narratives are carefully curated and transmitted. Through the education system and through key national heritage institutions like the National Museum, the Art Museum, the Peranakan Museum, the Asian Civilizations Museum, each has its defined role in shaping the national story.
So a curated version of history.
You could say a selective approach to historical interpretation, aimed at fostering national unity, which inevitably creates a tension with Singapore's undeniably cosmopolitan nature and global outlook.
In those early days after Raffles' arrival, managing such a diverse and rapidly growing population, it must have presented enormous challenges in terms of law and order, basic administration.
It certainly did. Raffles' initial town plan, which allocated specific quarters for different ethnic and trade groups, that reflected this diversity. But in the immediate aftermath, there was a significant lack of established administrative structures, law enforcement.
Right.
The establishment of a formal police force in 1812 was a crucial step in addressing the challenges posed by the burgeoning immigrant communities, including what were often referred to back then as troublesome classes. Measures like the Coolie Commission were also implemented later to regulate and control Chinese immigration, which was massive.
Okay.
As Singapore progressed towards self-government in the 1950s, there was this significant rise in political consciousness, the growth of labor movements, advocating for better rights, conditions.
Elsewhere awakening.
Exactly. The granting of limited self-government in 1955, based on the Rendell Commission report, and the subsequent achievement of full self-governance in 1959 under Lee Kuan Yew marked pivotal political milestones.
Right.
The PAP, with its clear focus on rapid economic growth and, yes, deliberate social engineering, then led Singapore's remarkable transformation into one of the economic powerhouses of Asia, one of the Asian tigers.
And the political landscape in Singapore since independence has been, well, remarkably consistent is one way to put it. The PAP holding a dominant position throughout.
Yes, Singapore has operated as a parliamentary democracy with a consistent dominance by the People's Action Party, PAP, since 1959. While a multi-party system exists in principle, the PAP has maintained its strong grip on power through a variety of means.
Such as? The sources mention a few things.
Including, as noted in some analyses, tight control over media and public discourse, strategic redrawing of electoral boundaries, gerrymandering, and the frequent use of defamation lawsuits against opposition figures.
Right, the lawsuits.
In the early years of independence, the PAP did face significant political and social unrest and a strong challenge from leftist political forces, which actually led to a notable decline in their initial level of popular support.
Before they consolidated power.
Before they consolidated, the PAP's legal battles against opposition politicians, often utilizing defamation laws, have been a recurring feature of Singapore's political landscape, as documented in the materials.
Geographically and administratively, how is a place as compact as Singapore actually organized? It's tiny on the map.
Well, despite its small size, Singapore is meticulously planned and organized. Its administrative and political boundaries encompass various planning zones. You have densely populated urban areas, more suburban and even some rural regions, and numerous offshore islands supporting industries, tourism, military use.
Okay.
The government has established these distinct planning zones to facilitate efficient urban development and resource management. Public transportation systems vary density, sophistication across these zones. The central urban areas boast a highly developed network of MRT lines, bus services.
It's known for its efficiency.
Very much so.
And, of course, Singapore's strategic location continues to be absolutely central to its role as a global maritime hub.
Yeah.
That hasn't changed.
Absolutely not. Singapore remains the world's busiest container port, by some measures, a testament to its enduring strategic importance. The transformation of the former British naval base into a thriving commercial port has been a remarkable success story, driving significant growth in shipping-related sectors like oil refining.
Right.
Singapore's economic policies, characterized by a significant degree of government intervention, long-term planning, they've been widely credited with its economic success. Even during periods of regional or global economic slowdown, the government has actively focused on internal economic restructuring and diversification.
Staying adaptable.
Exactly. The historical cooperation between the government, employers, and employee unions, including the early formation of race-based unions, has also contributed to Singapore's relative economic stability. The strategic shift from low-wage manufacturing to more technology-intensive assembly and high-value-added industries, that's been key. Though it initially presented some challenges related to labor force adaptation and maybe some nativism impacting growth temporarily.
Singapore's relationships with its neighboring countries, particularly within the framework of ASEAN, have also been incredibly important, haven't they, for stability and growth?
Hugely important. The analysis by scholars like Ellis and Poon mentioned in your sources highlights the deep and mutually influential relationships between ASEAN and Singapore, encompassing both political and economic dimensions. Singapore's active membership in ASEAN has provided a crucial diplomatic platform and a framework for navigating complex regional relationships, including its often nuanced, sometimes tense relationship with Malaysia.
Right, there have been ups and downs.
Definitely. Periods of considerable tension, like during former Malaysian PM Mahathir's proposals for a Greater Malaysia, or the economic blockade imposed on Singapore in the past. ASEAN's role as a regional boundary, defining a space of interaction and sometimes contention, is significant.
And Singapore's position.
Well, Singapore's unique position of holding dual membership in ASEAN and also having a significant defense pact with the United States underscores its strategic balancing act in the region.
Playing multiple angles.
You could say that. ASEAN's expansion over the years, its ongoing efforts in regional peacemaking, they face challenges, often yield slow results in areas like health, defense, but remain important for regional stability.
And historically, Singapore was part of older networks too.
Oh, yes. Singapore's historical involvement in pre-colonial and circumcolonial Chinese trading networks, facilitating the exchange of goods like whalebone, camphor, gutta percha, rattan, tortoiseshell, that underscores its long-standing regional economic interconnectedness even before Raffles. The arrival of the British just significantly altered the dynamics of these existing networks.
And its diplomatic effort beyond Southeast Asia, since achieving self-governance, have been very carefully considered and executed, according to the materials.
Indeed. Despite facing initial vulnerabilities, even threats to its sovereignty, particularly in its early years from Indonesia during confrontasi.
Right, the confrontation.
Singapore adopted a very deliberate and strategic diplomatic approach under Lee Kuan Yew's leadership. This involved carefully cultivating relationships with key countries around the world, goodwill visits, establishing diplomatic missions.
Very pragmatic.
Very pragmatic. The strategic selection of ambassadorial postings was also a crucial element, ensuring Singapore's interests were effectively represented and protected on the global stage.
Finally, when we look at Singapore's remarkable transformation, we also have to consider the environmental impact. Such rapid, intensive development on a small island, that must have consequences.
It inevitably does. Singapore, situated in a tropical rainforest climate, has undergone this truly extraordinary transformation. From a largely agrarian and forested landscape to a highly urbanized modern metropolis.
Yeah.
The clearing of primary and secondary rainforests for agriculture, settlements, port facilities. It began in the colonial era but accelerated dramatically after independence in 1965 to accommodate rapid population growth, economic expansion.
Land reclamation, too.
Extensive land reclamation projects, yes. They've significantly altered its coastline, impacting natural habitats like mangrove swamps and coral reefs. While the initial focus was understandably on economic survival and development,
Understandably.
there is now a growing recognition and increasing attention being paid to environmental issues, particularly in light of the accelerating impacts of global climate change. Sustainability is a bigger focus now.
And how has the whole phenomenon of globalization shaped Singapore's incredible journey? It seems tailor-made for it in some ways.
Globalization has presented both immense opportunities and significant challenges for Singapore. It successfully leveraged early waves of globalization to transform itself from that regional trading post into a major international financial center.
Right.
However, increasing global interdependence also brings new complexities, new vulnerabilities for the government, businesses, the community as a whole. A crucial ongoing question is how globalization will continue to impact Singapore's communication networks, its national identity, its ability to maintain its unique position in an ever more interconnected and sometimes volatile world.
So from that perhaps mythical lion sighting centuries ago to the global powerhouse we see today, Singapore's story is truly one of remarkable adaptation, strategic thinking, and, well, immense political will. The depth and complexity revealed in the sources you've shared are genuinely surprising, much more than just the modern miracle image.
Absolutely. A very long and complex history.
It leaves you pondering, doesn't it? In this constantly evolving global landscape, how will Singapore continue to navigate that delicate balance between its relentless pursuit of economic progress, which has defined it for so long, and the increasingly critical social and environmental considerations it faces, like all nations? It's certainly a question that lingers long after this deep dive into its fascinating history.